Most of the content of the Baptist Faith and Message 2000 are things that pretty much every Bible-believing Christian could agree with. The Baptist Faith and Message, as we've been going through this study together, is the doctrinal statement of the Southern Baptist Convention, the doctrinal statement that our church, Lakeshore Baptist Church, uses to help us think through these things. But most of the content in the Baptist Faith and Message 2000 are things that pretty much every Christian, Bible-believing Christian would agree with. However, there are several things that are really Baptist distinctives. For example, believers' baptism, of course, is a Baptist distinctive. We believe that the Bible teaches that only professing believers are to be baptized. Many other denominations will baptize infants. We don't baptize infants. We don't baptize someone until they're professing faith in Christ. And so that's a core Baptist distinctive. Also, regenerate church membership is a Baptist distinctive. And we talked about that in the Doctrine of the Church, another session. We talked about baptism in another session. Regenerate church membership simply means that we believe that only believers are legitimate members of a church. Many other denominations don't hold to that. And so there's some Baptist distinctives in there. And one Baptist distinctive that some people may not even realize is a Baptist distinctive is religious liberty. Religious liberty. Now, sure, so now some other denominations might agree with us, but religious liberty is really a core Baptist belief, a Baptist distinctive, if you will. And a little bit of trivia, you may not know this, but the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, where that ensures the freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and those things, was really pushed by Baptists. John Leland and Isaac Backus and those guys really pushed for that First Amendment because Baptists believe very strongly in religious liberty. And so let's dive right into the text of this article on religious liberty. You'll find the text of it in the description below. You can also follow the link to the Southern Baptist Convention website where you'll see the entire document there, as well as the scripture references linked to the Bible passages. You can just click on those at that link, and it'll take you to the Bible passages that I really encourage you to read. That's really where we're getting our theology from Scripture, not a man-made document, even though the Baptist Faith and Message is a very helpful document to help us think through some of these things. And so let's look at it. The first sentence of this article is really foundational and gives sort of theological framework for what we believe, the implications of the practicality of it. And so let me read it for you and talk about it a little bit. It says, God alone is the Lord of the conscience, and he has left it free from the doctrines and commandments of men, which are contrary to the his word, or not contained in it. And so this really talks about the freedom of conscience, not to be confused with the doctrine, the discussion about the freedom of the will. That's a whole different discussion. But our conscience is free. The Lord alone, God alone, is the Lord of the conscience. And basically, to parse this out and kind of put it on the bottom shelf to help us understand what this means is basically you can't coerce someone to believe something. You can't make someone believe something. You can try to convince them. You can show them evidence, but you can't coerce it. Only God can change a person's heart. Only God can change somebody's mind. Really, we might externally do something, but you can't change. You can't even change your own belief by an act of your will, and that does get into the free will discussion. But you can't just choose to believe something. You can choose to say something, and someone can coerce you to say something or profess something, but they can't make you believe something. If that doesn't make any sense, let me use an illustration, and this might be a silly illustration, and sometimes I like using silly illustrations. It helps you think about it a little bit. Let's suppose you and I are sitting on a porch, on my porch, okay? And we're sitting there, and you see a chicken walk by in the yard, right? There's a little chicken, and it's a chicken's walking by, and he goes by, and I say, hey, you see my dog right there? And you look like, that ain't a dog, that's a chicken, right? You would you see it with your own eyes. It's a chicken. It's not a dog. And so let's suppose, and this is where the silly part comes in, I say, no, that's a dog. And this is my porch. This is my yard. And I say, that's a dog. You better say that's a dog too. You better believe that's a dog too. If you don't believe that's a dog, and I pull out a gun, I'm going to shoot you in the foot. And I point my gun at your foot and say, if you don't believe that that's a dog, I'm going to shoot you in the foot. Now, what you going to do? You might say, well, you're going to say, you're crazy. But you might say, okay, that's a dog. Right? Now, do you believe it's a dog? No. But you've been coerced to say it's a dog. But you don't believe it. You still believe it's a chicken. You see it. It's a chicken. Right? You see what I'm saying? You can't change. I can't force you to change your belief. I can force you to change your profession so you don't get shot in the foot. But I can't change your belief. Now, let's suppose, I add part 2 to this illustration, and this is going to make sense, hopefully, when we go through some more of this. Let's suppose you see that chicken run into a bush or something, right? And then a little while later, you see some rustling in that bush, and we're still sitting on the same porch, and I say, there's a dog in that bush. And you say, no, that ain't a dog in the bush. That's a chicken. I saw the chicken run in the bush. And I'm like, no, that's a dog in the bush. And then I tell you, look a little bit closer. And you look a little bit closer, and sure enough, you see a little tail sticking out the back of that side of that bush, a little furry tail wagging, right? And you say, sure enough, that is a dog in there. And then I say, look, there's the chicken. It went over there. And you look, there's the chicken. Now see, I changed your mind, but not by force, but by evidence. Now, why am I telling you this story? Because that is how the gospel works. And that's how religious convictions work. The gospel, for example, I can't put a gun to somebody's head or to their foot and say, or shoot them in the leg. I can't say, I'm going to shoot you in the leg if you don't repeat after me the sinner's prayer and get baptized. Well, they might repeat after me the sinner's prayer and they might get baptized, but does that mean they're saved? Well, of course not. You can't change somebody's heart. You can't change somebody's belief by coercing them, but you can give them the gospel. You can give them the evidence. And God can change their heart by seeing the evidence of their own sinfulness and seeing the supremacy of Christ and what Christ did on the cross. And they're convinced externally, but you can't force it to. You see, if you could force it to, then I would say, if that's the way it worked, it's not how it works. That's not how the Bible tells it works. If that is how it works, I would not be for religious liberty. I'd say, let's make a law today that everybody, when they get to a certain age, they need to pray the sinner's prayer and get baptized. And we'll just force it or we'll put you in jail. If that's how it worked. It doesn't work that way. And so that's why we as Baptists especially say, that's one of the reasons, maybe the biggest reason, that God is the Lord of the conscience. And so we preach the gospel freely and see people's hearts changed by God. And so that's sort of the theological groundwork. Now let's see the implications here. And I'll probably come back to that illustration in a minute. Well, let's look at the next sentence in the statement. It says, church and state should be separate, period. Church and state should be separate. That's a bold statement, right? Now, so I'll go ahead and say it. The separation of church and state is a Baptist distinctive. Now, I try to be patient and with folks, because a lot of times people will bristle up because of that when they say, what? And the reason why is because there's a lot of confusion over this issue in our culture today. We do believe in the separation of church and state. We do not believe in the separation of God from government. We don't believe in the separation of ethics and morality from the public square. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about separation of church and state. When we talk about separation of church and state, you have to understand we're talking about the institution of the church. God instituted the church, and the institution of the state. God instituted human government as well. And the state is its own thing, and the church is its own thing, and God is Lord over them all. You see. And so the church is not over the state is not over the church. That doesn't mean that we as Christians can't speak to the state. We can't speak to government. And praise the Lord, in America we can vote and all the rest. And so we ought to be doing those things. But what we mean by the church and state, they're not the same institution. They're not the same. They have two distinct roles, and one is not to govern the other. That doesn't mean that we as believers shouldn't have a voice in the public square. We absolutely should, and make those convictions known. And we'll get to that as well. But I just want to clarify that the separation of church and state is a good thing. We want that. We're in favor of that. We click like on separation of church and state. And so we need to keep that in mind. And rightly understood, though, that does not mean that the state ought to be pushing the secularist agenda. And so we need to be careful about that as well. We believe that the church and state ought to be separate. Then look at the next sentence. It says the state, and so here's the relationship between the church and state. There's several sentences here that explains sort of the relationship between the church and the state and what they owe to each other. It says the state owes to every church protection and full freedom in pursuit of its spiritual ends. And so the state should be protecting the church and allowing it to function. Now, I need to be careful about that word allowing there, because this is very important as well. The government does not give us religious liberty. God gives us religious liberty. That's not the prerogative of the state. The state doesn't have authority there. What they are to do is recognize our religious liberty as a right before God. That's why we're very careful to say here that the state owes to the church protection, to protect its God-given right. That's why we say we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. God gives those inalienable rights. God is the one, not the government. The government doesn't give us religious liberty. God gives us religious liberty. It's the government or the state. If you want to use those words distinctly, the state has a responsibility to protect our God-given rights. You see, because the state is to be subservient to God as well as the church. And so that's important for us to point out. And so we as a church are to be free to pursue our spiritual ends. Then the next sentence, it says, in providing for such freedoms, no ecclesiastical group, and ecclesiastical is a big word for church. The Greek word for church in the New Testament is ecclesia, and so, which means a called out assembly, by the way. The ecclesia, or the study of the church, is ecclesiology. And so no ecclesiastical group or denomination should be favored by the state more than others. And so we say, look, the state shouldn't favor one religious group over another, one denomination over another. There should be religious liberty. And I don't want to chase this rabbit too far, but the Constitution, for example, by the way, that I mentioned just a moment ago, the First Amendment only deals with the federal government, not the states. Some people don't know this, but many of the states, Massachusetts, for example, had a state religion for the state of Massachusetts into the 1800s, I believe. So, but we believe that that's not the role of the state. When I say the state, I mean the government, the federal government, or any human institution, government institution. So they're not to favor one over the other. That's an important religious liberty aspect. They're to have an equal playing field, right? And we believe that we need to protect those freedoms, not just for ourselves, but for others. It says the civil government, as I'm using the word state, or the civil government, being ordained of God, Romans 13, God has ordained the civil government. It is the duty of Christians to render loyal obedience thereunto in all things, not contrary to the revealed will of God. Now, here that is a very, very important point. We can bring in Romans 13 and other passages that we as citizens, as Christians, in whatever governmental system that we are in, for me and probably you here in the United States, we are to be obedient to the governing authorities. When does that obedience end? Well, when they mandate something that is contrary to the will of God. And that's a very important distinction. We don't, I believe, and I think that the Baptist Faith and Message bears this out, and I believe Scripture bears this out, we're not free to disobey the government just because we disagree with the law. We can't say, well, I don't think that the speed limit ought to be this, and so I'm going to go that. I don't believe that this is a legitimate law, and so I'm going to do that. No, we don't really have that prerogative. The only time that we are to rebel and disobey the civil government is when those mandates are directly in opposition to what God's revealed will for us. And so, for example, if the government said you have to, commit some sin, we would say no. We're not going to commit that sin. You're overstepping your bounds. And so the government only has certain boundaries that they're in, and when they overstep those bounds, it is our obligation to disobey those things. And that's a big discussions nowadays of when the government becomes a tyrant, and that we ought to defy tyrants. Well, what constitutes a tyrant? Is it just because we don't like what laws they are? No, it's when they're contrary to the revealed will of God. And so that's a very important distinction. And maybe you can think through those things. And there's so many illustrations that pop into my mind. I don't want to take the time to sort of flesh a lot of that out. I'm trying to stay big picture here. And so, but it does have very serious implications for us today. And we've had a lot. Well, I'll mention this. There's been a lot of these discussions surrounding the COVID-19 thing in 2020. And when the state has the authority and right to say that churches should not gather. I'm glad that we live in the state of Mississippi, that I minister in the state of Mississippi, and our governor, Tate Reeves, and I might not agree with everything that he did with COVID-19, but I do like one thing that he said one day when people asked him, when this is back in, I guess it was April or so, when pretty much everything was locked down. They were thinking that millions and millions of people were going to die. And so they were really trying to be as cautious as possible. And but somebody asked him, when is he going to reopen the churches? Everybody was shut down. And he said, I don't have the authority to reopen the churches. I don't have the authority to shut down the churches. And I'm grateful that Mississippi has a governor that realizes his jurisdiction. He did recommend it. He said, I hope that the pastors will do the right thing. At that time, he thought that they would. He felt like, and the doctors thought it was the right thing not to hold public church services. But he said, I don't have the authority to do that, you see. And so those are some interesting discussions that we need to have. When do we defy what the government mandated? And we can follow things like I said I wasn't going to chase this rabbit, and I am. If you follow the church in Nevada, for example, there was a church in Nevada where the state said that casinos could open, but churches couldn't. And there wasn't an equity there, and there was some serious problems. Or in California with John MacArthur's church, where they were trying to shut them down, and they were still meeting, defying the court orders and all the rest. And so there's some interesting discussions that need to be had about what it means for religious liberty especially in our own context of the United States. Let's look at the next sentence. It says, the church should not, here's kind of the flip side of that. The church should not resort to the civil powers to carry on its work. And then the next sentence is the same idea. It says, the gospel of Christ contemplates spiritual means alone for the pursuit of its ends. And so here's what we're saying. There's two sentences here, and it's saying that we as a church, or we as Christians, should not resort to the civil powers to pursue our ends. The gospel doesn't work that way. And that was why I gave the illustration at the beginning about the gospel not really working that way. We can't force somebody to believe a certain way. We can't force somebody to believe a certain way. The gospel doesn't work that way. And so we should not resort to the state to say, hey, why don't we just lock everybody up that doesn't agree with us? No, you can't do that. We don't believe to do that. We should not resort to the government trying to do our job. It is the church's job. It is a believer's job. It's a Christian's job to preach the gospel. And the state is just to protect the church and allow it to do its thing. You see, we're not to resort to the government to do those things. And so it's a very important point to be made. It says that the state has no right. And you hear that strong language. I kind of like it. The state has no right. The state has no right to impose penalties on religious opinions of any kind. This is very. It's always been extremely important, but this is especially important in our day. When the state is really trying to silence the Christian opinion in the public square, and saying, okay, you can believe whatever you want to believe, just keep it inside the walls of your church, and so religious liberty and freedom of speech go kind of hand in hand. And if you think that in America they're not trying to minimize that, you're not paying attention, because especially with this recent election, there are those within the coming administration that are wanting to push what's called these new sexual rights over against religious rights or religious liberty, sexual liberty over against religious liberty, where your opinion on those matters are going to be punished in certain contexts. That a school, for example, a religious school, a seminary, or whatever, can't say this is what we believe, and this is going to have implications to our hiring practices and other things. And so we don't say that the government has no right to squelch religious opinions of any kind. It also says that the state has no right to impose penalties of religious opinions of any kind, or I just said that. And then the next sentence, because it starts the same way, the state has no right to impose taxes for the support of any form of religion. And so you might be surprised, in the early Americas, they actually did that. They had, it was taxes to pay the minister. And we would say, no, that's not how it works. We need to make sure that line of separation is very strong, and that we should not be using tax money to promote spiritual ends. And the reason why, if you think about it, people get taxes really confused. Taxation is the forcible taking of money from people, and the government only has a legitimate right to do that in certain circumstances. You don't force somebody to give money in order to use it for spiritual ends. That should be voluntary, right? And so that's why we add this in there, that we should not be relying on tax money to promote our religious and spiritual ends. It says, a free church in a free state is the Christian ideal. And so I like there's a turn of phrase there. A free church and a free state is the Christian ideal. And this implies the right of free and unhindered access to God on the part of all men, and the right to form and propagate opinions in the sphere of religion without interference by the civil powers. In other words, the civil powers have no right to try to restrict our worship, to restrict our proclamation of the gospel. It's a free church in a free state. That is the Christian ideal. And so I hope this is helpful. We kind of went through a lot of big topics today, and this is one of those topics that I could go on and on all day long, but I want to go ahead and cut it off here and pray that it's helpful. Read over this document, because this issue is one of those things that I think a lot of Christians have not really thought through. Some people have, and God bless you if you have, but a lot of Christians haven't. It gets kind of confusing to some people. And maybe I should add one other thought here, because here's where sometimes it gets a little bit confusing, because there seems to be a fine line between fighting for religious liberty and promoting religious pluralism. Religious pluralism is the idea that we have all these other denominations and all these religions, not just Christian religions, but other religions as well. And we as Baptists believe in religious liberty. If, for example, Mormonism, I believe Mormonism is a cult. It's a false religion. But I believe that in America, they have the right to exist. I don't want the government to shut them down. Why? Because I don't want the government to shut us down either. But also, it's because we believe that only God is the Lord of the conscience, right? And so I would fight for their freedom to exist. However, at the same time, I'm going to preach against their false doctrine, and I'm free to do that. I'm going to teach against their false doctrine. I'm going to promote what is right and criticize what is wrong. Even though, as far as the state is concerned, they have a right to be here, and they ought to. And that goes for other religions as well. Hopefully that makes sense. Saying that we're fighting for their religious liberty does not mean that we think that they're okay. No, we don't want to promote religious pluralism. No, our desire is that everybody would be a Christian. We just know that you can't use the tactics of the state to force that on anybody. And so that's why we want freedom, the freedom of religion, the freedom of speech. We proclaim the gospel, and God changes hearts. And so that's why we say a free church in a free state is the Christian ideal. Like I said, I hope this is helpful. And let me encourage you to look up the Full Baptist Faith and Message 2000. If you haven't been following these sessions, subscribe to the YouTube channel here and click like. That's helpful, encouraging to me to know that somebody's out there watching these. And Lord willing, next session, we'll wrap these studies up with the doctrine of the family. Very interesting discussion we'll have next session. And so God bless you. I pray that you have a good week, and I'll see you at church.